Okay, everybody, welcome back. We are joined yet again by certainly one of my favorite guests, a man who is familiar with controversy on many different levels, but somebody I admire both for his intellectual rigor and honesty. Somebody who has really challenged me to change a number of my own personal views on a number of subjects. Dr. Michael Behe, thanks again for taking the time to come on the show.
Yeah, it's always great to be with you, Pat.
So I don't want to spend too much time on reintroductions, but fortunately there are always new listeners, and it wasn't too long ago that we had you on in a dialogue with Dr. Joshua Swamidas, where we had a very spirited and I think fruitful exchange over the work you've done and the intelligent design movement. But for any newcomers, would you mind just briefly reintroducing yourself and giving us the relevant background?
Sure. My name is Mike Behe. I'm a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. And I'm a Catholic. I was raised in a Catholic family. And I used to be a normal biochemist, normal scientist. But back in the 1980s, I read a book that challenged my thinking about Darwinian evolution. And so I looked into it myself, particularly at the molecular level of life, which biochemistry studies. And I was startled to find that nobody had really even tried to explain the phenomenally elegant and complex systems that are found there. I had always assumed up to that point that somebody had, but it turns out nobody did. And that kind of set me off. I got a little bit mad and became interested in the issue, and pretty soon decided that the evidence, the physical evidence, pointed to purposeful intelligent design. And I've written a few books on the topic, and that kind of they became controversial, and I've been in the fray ever since then.
Yeah, controversial to say the absolute least. I mean, part of our conversation with Dr. Swamidas last time was talking about I guess the now infamous Kitts-Miller trial of the whole intelligent design, and you were involved in that, and that's a very fascinating story in and of itself. But I think we all agree that a courtroom is not necessarily the best place to settle ideas of this sort. So we have to move beyond that. We were kind of laughing a little bit before we started hitting record of how we tend to have the same conversation over and over again. Yep. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say my phone's ringing. So
yeah, if you need to take it, we can hit pause. Is that okay?
No, I don't. I just thought it might mess up the audio here.
No, don't worry about that. Okay. Yeah, gentle listeners are used to distractions, usually on my end, so no big deal. But getting back to the point is, it seems like a lot of times we come back to the same old objections over and over again, and the thing to intelligent design and the work that you've done. And the thing that surprises me is I go casting about, and I try to find thinkers that I can have dialogue with you, who are relevant experts, who are going to know the literature, and who are going to be able to deliver the death punch, right? Who are going to be able to put this thing down, and I bring them on. And again, I'm surprised at how superficial the objections are, and how there has just not been a substantive case against the issues that you've raised for the neo-Darwinian paradigm. And I want to get into that. And I've been reflecting on the conversation that we had with Dr. Swamidas not too long ago. And yeah, it just really strikes me that like at some point here's I guess the first question, and maybe this isn't the best one to start off with, but at what point do we have to abandon the principle of charity? Right? You know what I mean? It's something that I try to hold very seriously as a Catholic, right? You always want to give people the benefit of the doubt. You always want to look at their arguments in the best light. But Josh brought up Alvin Plantinga last time, and his book of where the conflict really lies. But there's actually a passage in that book that struck me from Alvin that I think is interesting. And he says, when it comes to a number of scientists or philosophers who are often Christian, and he says this is uncharitable, but he thinks there might be something to it. They often suffer from what's called disciplinary low self-esteem. And they feel this need to present themselves as more secular than thou, so they can have a spot at the lunch table. And as I'm reflecting on the previous conversations and saying, where the heck is the case? I can't help but find myself gravitating towards maybe that as at least a partial explanation. Is that the wrong tone to start off with, Dr. Behe? I'd love your thoughts on it.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. You should never give up on charity. I wrote an article in First Things, the journal First Things, 15 or 20 years ago. And one of the points that I made was that Christians have a lot of freedom in interpreting nature. We could say, well, maybe God did this, or maybe he set up the natural laws to let things unfold, or somewhere in between, whatever. So that's a freedom that we have, but there's a problem because secular folks, or folks who are dead set against having anything beyond nature, they insist that everything has to operate by natural law. And so the pressure on Christians, especially in science, is to gravitate towards the absolute limit, where we don't claim anything needed special consideration, so that we don't conflict with the folks that do. And that's a problem, because since Christianity is compatible with almost complete unfolding of nature on its own as a practical matter, then even Christian scientists will default to that. And even if the evidence, even if the evidence is not there. And right. I think that's one of the things that's happening.
Yeah, that also reminds me of something that Flanagan has said elsewhere, or it might be in the same book, that that Christians, they can really be open to the evidence. And for example, if your critiques were wrong, it would change nothing for me, because that isn't what made me a theist in the first place. It's the more philosophical arguments for God and the soul, and then the historical evidence for Christianity. So, the whole intelligent design movement could be completely wrong in every respect, and it really wouldn't affect me. The reason I'm so interested in it is because I don't think it's wrong. I think it's true. And right. but here's why I think it's very interesting, because you do see so much hostility to it. And I think it goes back to what Flanagan says, is he says it's not the same case, especially for the atheist. For them, like this has to be right. The neo-Darwinian people, because if it's not right, there isn't room to maneuver. There's nowhere else to go. So you could see why there are certain social political pressures to put a sort of Castro consensus around this thing, right? Because if this, and it's different, because it's true that even if the philosophical arguments go through, atheism is finished on that, right? But those are more abstract. They go over people's heads. They're not in the public conversation as much as evolution is. So it seems like there's more of a, and I'm just thinking out loud here, it seems like there's more of a social or political shielding around that. Do you agree with any of what I've said?
Absolutely. Since forever, since recorded history started, people have written about the argument for design, that nature looks designed. Why look at the regular movements of stars and planets and the sun, and look, how an acorn grows up to be an oak tree, and everything follows, and it looks strongly designed. And then Charles Darwin comes along and says, no, wait, I have an explanation. It doesn't look designed. It does look designed, but I've got this other explanation for it. So the thing is that his idea is battling against strong evidence for design. We actually conclude design by seeing how parts fit together, and how things behave for a purpose. And he's battling against that, and quite frankly, doesn't have strong evidence. So in order to have this idea succeed, that is that unguided natural processes could produce the complexity and function of life, you've got to, rule with an iron fist. You've got to say, everybody has to believe this. And if you don't believe it, we will mock you. We'll say how stupid you are. And we'll say, you're just doing this for unstated reasons, like to prop up your silly worldview and so on. Yeah. So there's a lot of social pressure. As a matter of fact, I think that, well, Darwinism does explain some things, but for its grand claims, social pressure is the only thing it has. It certainly doesn't have evidence to show that the elegant systems of life could have arisen by Darwin's mechanism.
Right. So let's make some clarifications and distinctions for people who are new to this conversation, because intelligent design, this could mean a lot of different things, but so does evolution, right? Evolution is something of an accordion term, right? It sometimes is expanded to mean a whole bunch of stuff. But for your work, the work that we're interested in, you're offering a very specific critique. You're not arguing against the idea that evolution occurred. You're arguing against the proposal for how it occurred, the mechanism, what's driving evolution. So for people who are new to this conversation, can you give us just the lay of the land here? Specifically what your project and critique has been?
Sure. First thing you have to remember is that Darwin was not the first person to propose evolution. That is, that modern organisms have been derived somehow from organisms in the past. Before Darwin, a number of scientists proposed something like that, but it was always a teleological process. It was guided or inbuilt or some such thing. Darwin's claim to fame wasn't the proposal of evolution, but of a mechanical unfolding of evolution with no need for foresight, no teleology, no purpose, nothing like that. And so intelligent design, as I use it, simply means that when you look at something, you can tell that an intelligent agent, a mind, was needed to put this system together. And there's a phrase that I use, and that's a purposeful arrangement of parts. Whenever you see parts that have been put in relationship to each other, then you can tell that a mind was behind it, because only minds have purposes. And if the arrangement has a purpose, therefore a mind is behind it. And, just think of a mousetrap, which I use in my first book. A mousetrap has pieces that have been fit to each other for a purpose. It doesn't have to be mechanical parts. It could be events. I've used used an example of a murderer who is so careful that when he kills his victim, no investigator can distinguish it from an accident. And so, hey, we couldn't tell that was design, but we would know it was murder if we knew the facts. But if that murderer killed 10 people, even in the same stealth way, but they were all scheduled to be witnesses in his upcoming drug trial, we would be certain it was design, because we could see the purpose and the different pieces arranged for that purpose. So intelligent design simply disputes that Darwin's mechanism of unintelligent processes being responsible for very profound, purposeful arrangement of parts is incorrect, that a mind is behind that. How that was done, when it was done, why it was done, who did it even, all those are open questions. We all have our own, we all probably have our own ideas of what's more likely than others, but yeah, that's the only difference, that design says it could not occur by Darwin's teleological mechanism.
Right. Yeah. Very good. So, in a similar way, right, we can infer that design occurred without knowing how it occurred, when it occurred, who did it. I keep bringing up Flanagan because I just revisited his book, so it's somewhat fresh in my mind. The idea that if we go to a distant planet and we find something that looks and sounds like a radio, right, our first natural inference is going to be life is out here, right? Right. And we don't know who designed it. We don't know where it came from. Right.
Yeah.
But that's,
alien.
Yeah. Now, here's no, go ahead.
I was just going to mention, there's a story in the news the past few days where some biologists working for the Forestry Service or something in Utah found this obelisk, very reminiscent of 2001: A Space Odyssey. There was a story in the New York Times this morning. It's this big metal, smoothly shaped thing right smack out in the desert, and the government said it's illegal to put such things, whether it's a piece of art or something, no matter what planet you're from, you're not allowed to do that. So everybody sees that this is a designed object because they see, well, they assume it has a purpose because it's much differently shaped and from the surrounding areas. So we recognize design pretty easily.
Right. Now here's for people who are watching on YouTube, this is the cover of your new book. And that looks like a pretty elegant system right there, Dr. Behe. What are we looking at?
Well, that thing on the cover is a portion of the bacterial flagellum. And a flagellum is quite literally an outboard motor that bacteria use to swim. I mean, literally an outboard motor. It's got a propeller which spins round and round, and the propeller is attached to the motor by something called a drive, or something called the hook region, which is a universal joint which allows motion in one plane to be transferred to motion in another plane. And there's the motor, which uses a flow of acid from the outside of the cell to the inside to power its turning, kind of like water flowing over a dam can turn a turbine engine. And it has a stator to clamp it on to the bacterial membrane so it doesn't move while the propeller is turning. And it's got a lot more parts to it as well. So, so I've used that for the past 25 years as a splendid example of what I mean by purposeful arrangement of parts and the problem for Darwinism, because that doesn't work pretty much until it's almost finished, until it's finished being put together. So it's hard to see what natural selection would have to select as intermediate steps if you're trying to build something like that.
Right. So this is the idea of irreducible complexity. And this is what I want to focus in on for two reasons. Is one is, and we can see how this is an appropriate analogy with a mousetrap, right? If you remove one of the parts, the system collapses, right? It doesn't perform its function. So it's really hard, if not virtually impossible, to see how this could be built in a stepwise function, right? Now, let me know if this is maybe a fair summary of your argument, right? Maybe we'd say something like, if Darwin's mechanism is true, then we wouldn't expect irreducibly complex systems to evolve, right? And then right. I guess in that sense, one man's modus ponens becomes another man's modus tollens. We do have irreducibly complex systems. So this seems to count strongly against Darwin's mechanism. Do you think that's a fair, would you put it that way?
Yes, as a matter of fact, Darwin himself put it that way. He said, he wrote in The Origin of Species that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been put together by numerous successive slight modifications, he said, my theory would absolutely break down. So yeah, he realized this would be a problem, and the response of Darwinists to things like this, even himself, even Darwin, he talked about the eye. is to make up stories where they say, well, maybe it went this way and then that way and then the other way and turned around. And so make up imaginative stories where they can try to think of a route where it might be put together gradually, but it's all in their head. When you try to do it in nature or in a laboratory experiment, it certainly doesn't work.
Right. Good. Yeah. I want to dial in on this because every time I talk to you, I always try and see what's going on in the conversation, if there's anything new that I missed. And Dr. Ken Miller recently had a conversation with Dr. Swamidas as well. And I'm like, okay, let's see if, see what this is all about here. And so I listened to that. Interesting conversation. I don't want to discourage people from watching it. I think it was just interesting to hear Dr. Miller's perspective on the trial. But at the end, they finally get to your mousetrap example. And I'm not sure if you've seen this or not. We can link it.
No.
And one of the other biologists there, I think Dr. Lenz, asked Dr. Miller to explain what's wrong with your mousetrap analogy. And lo and behold, we get the same conversation again, right? Well, this idea of exaptation, right? And this came up in the conversation with Dr. Swamidas as well, was that, well, maybe you have these different parts, right, that are serving different functions, that somehow come together and then they coordinate towards this new function, which is whatever the thing is. In this case, we'll just stick with the mousetrap. And I frankly said to Dr. Swamidas in our conversation is that sounds like voodoo to me. Like, if that's an explanation, why don't you just use the word magic? It seems as explanatorily satisfying to me. Like, do we have any evidence? Do we have any experiments where this has ever been done? But I think we can offer a stronger critique as well. Maybe, because I know I'm sorry if I sound a little frustrated, because I know that you've responded to this a million different times in print. And I know that they had to have seen your responses. So this is where I get a little bit agitated. I can't imagine how you feel, because it's like, well, it's not like we haven't had this conversation before. So please, why don't you chime in at this point?
I'm with you. I respond and point out difficulties and problems and stuff with a number of folks' answers, but nobody on the other side has responded. Nobody has taken my responses seriously. Yes, I got the response for the mousetrap from Ken Miller 20 years ago and have written a number of things about that. He says that, well, you can have a tie clip. If you take away a piece of a mousetrap, you can use it as a tie clip. I remember being with him at the national, what's it called, in New York City, the Museum of Natural History, and saying to the audience, we were there in front of an audience of 500 people. I said, guys, anybody here have a tie with a tie clip? Does it look anything like this mousetrap that Ken Miller is holding? You wouldn't expect it to be shaped that way if it were being used for a different purpose. And yet again, here he is 20 years later saying the same thing with Josh Swamidas. Worse, I had a new book come out in early 2019 called Darwin Devolves. And it was reviewed in Science, the journal Science. And it was reviewed by, Josh Swamidas, along with two other folks. The other one was Nathan Lentz, who was in on that conversation with Ken Miller. And the other one was Richard Lenski, who is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, who has done a decades-long evolution experiment and so on. I thought, great, Lenski is exactly the guy to analyze my argument that, that evolutionary processes work, Darwinian processes work, random mutation, natural selection, but overwhelmingly it's by degrading things that are already there. And as a matter of fact, his own experiment shows that. And in the review, which was published 2 weeks before my book came out, they wanted to control the conversation, I think, from the start. They didn't talk about it. Lenski's didn't even talk about his own work. And they brought up a bunch of old objections that I had responded to in print numerous times over the years. And they said explicitly, we don't take Behe seriously because he doesn't engage. He doesn't engage with the criticisms, which is untrue. What they mean is that I don't think their criticisms are good, and that I haven't, I don't, therefore I'm forging ahead. They essentially just don't want to bother this. They just want this to go away.
Right. And that's where that's exactly why I started the conversation out where I did, because I have read your books and I've read page after page after page of you responding to those criticisms. So irregardless of their responses to your responses, it's just not true. It's just not true that you don't engage. Like that's just not, and that really irritates me, right? Because it just seems either very ignorant or intellectually dishonest, and it just isn't it just isn't proper, right? The other thing I wanted to bring up about some of the objections, and by the way, we'll talk more specifically about your book, because I have to encourage people again that a podcast conversation like this is not enough. You have to read the published work. You have to read the books. Hopefully, it's just intrigued you enough to read these written responses. Another one that Dr. Swamidas brought up that surprised me was Dr. Draper's philosophical argument. And this one surprised me because I thought it was a terrible argument, the idea of evolution by letter. And it sort of strikes me as an odd double standard in terms of falsification and evidence when it comes to Darwinism that we don't accept anywhere else, because Draper's criticism is essentially that, well, you, Dr. B, haven't shown that it's conceptually or logically impossible for this to occur, right? Like you're trying to present some type of airtight metaphysical demonstration against Darwinism. Right. And that's completely, to me, that seems ridiculous, because I guess it's not logically or conceptually impossible that the Great Pyramids weren't constructed by a series of sandstorms, but it seems like all the evidence we have about what sandstorms do does not make Great Pyramids, right? So if this is the best we've got, is a confused philosophical argument against all the empirical evidence that counts against Darwin's theory, and the only thing that you have in defense of the theory, or at least one of the strongest defenses you have in defense of your scientific model or theory, is just that it hasn't shown to be logically impossible. What are we doing at this point, right? Right? Are we doing?
That's right. It's fascinating to see scientists who say that, we've got this really, really great theory, say that, well, to your objection, I'm going to offer this philosophical argument. Well, you're the scientist, show the scientific evidence against it. And people wave hands. But yeah, it was astonishing to me too. For listeners who haven't heard about it, Josh Swamidas, a biologist, was citing an argument of David Draper, a philosopher, who said essentially that, well, if you have a system A that does some function F, but it needs part B, and kind of, talking just conceptually, that's interesting, but it's not a scientific argument. And then the gist is that they fault me for not showing that, as you say, that it's logically impossible. But there is no science. You cannot show that anything is logically impossible with science. Science is an empirical discipline. You got to go out and see what the evidence shows, and therefore you might have incomplete evidence or something. Other evidence might show up tomorrow that'll make you reconsider, but that's science. So they're asking of my explanation of intelligent design something that no other scientific theory has ever had to show.
Right. And one of the things that struck me when I first started becoming curious about intelligent design is that I guess I would read the, the mainstream commentary, right? Which is very, very hostile. I mean, even if I haven't been to your Wikipedia page in a minute, Dr. Behe, but last time I visited it, it's not, it's not the most, yeah, it's not the, it's so like given, given the mainstream narrative of how silly and stupid and pseudoscientific this is, then what I would expect the refutations to be just hasn't been that at all, right? I would expect that in a dialogue, if this was true in a dialogue between you and Dr. Swamidas or anybody else, that they would just be like, here's this study, here's that study, here's this experiment, here's that experiment. And that's not what we have, is it? Right?
Exactly right.
They don't back up the rhetoric. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If it's so utterly dumb, this idea, and there's so much evidence against it, you'd think that, well, I'll just produce it. But nobody has been able to, and nobody engages with the argument.
So you wrote your first book back in the 90s, and now you have the most recent one. Well, two recent ones. You have this one, which is a collection of essays responding to your critics, which is phenomenal from what I've read so far. But you have the one that we talked about last year, which is Darwin Devolves. And I think it's important for people to understand that your case is only building. It's a cumulative case, and that we've had a fair amount of time now for people to really mount evidence against your original case. What's the status here? What does your new book add to your original arguments? And what's the difference between what we knew scientifically in the mid 90s and what we know now?
Okay, yeah, well, science is really relentless, and in this past several decades, science has advanced by leaps and bounds, especially biology. But with one exception, there has been no progress at all in trying to explain how Darwinian processes could have built the increasingly complex machinery of life. I've written three books that are new arguments. Darwin's Black Box in the mid 90s, and another book called The Edge of Evolution in 2007, and then Darwin Devolves last year, 2019. And they make separate cases. They're not dwelling on the same thing. Darwin's Black Box, the main theme was to show the complexity and elegance of the foundation of life, because Darwin knew nothing about that. Scientists of his age thought that the cell was just a little blob of jelly, and it turns out that's not the case. It's sophisticated beyond human understanding, really. And I described some molecular machinery and showed that it was irreducibly complex and therefore a big problem for Darwin's mechanism. And I also said, well, we recognize design by the purposeful arrangement of parts, and therefore design is a good explanation. And in the next book, Edge of Evolution, I asked, well, what do we see evolution doing when we have good data on it in the wild? And I talked about the development of resistance to chloroquine by the malaria parasite. And I showed that it took uncounted numbers of malarial cells, tens of thousands of generations, to come up with two crummy little changes in a pre-existing molecular machine, 2 point mutations, for those who know what that means. And it just came up with a little modification of a pre-existing machine. So Darwinian processes simply wouldn't have the time, far from it. You wouldn't expect them to be able to make the stuff we find in life. And then last year, Darwin Devolves showed that when you are able to track down the beneficial mutations, in the great majority of cases, they are degradations. They break pre-existing genes, and that helps. And as an example, consider the polar bear that arose from the brown bear. If you break a gene that's involved in making its pigmentation, its fur color, hey, now it's white and it blends in better with its background. Turns out if you break a gene in fat metabolism, it actually helps it to be able to eat more fat for convoluted reasons. But the point is that in many examples we now know, including Richard Lenski's decades-long laboratory evolution experiment with Darwin's finches in the Galapagos, with African cichlids, with plants, the lobelias in Hawaii, and with fruit flies in Hawaii, from plants to animals, invertebrates to vertebrates, fish, birds, whatever, it always seems that it's degradation which is selected and does help organisms improve, but that's not going to explain how sophisticated systems got there in the first place. So this is a long rant, but yeah, that's the argument is continuing to develop, and it's just getting stronger and stronger.
Right. And no, I really appreciate you taking the time to spell that out, because the idea there is that we're not saying that Darwin's mechanism doesn't do anything, right?
No.
We're just saying it's limited. It's limited in what it can do and limited in what it can explain. And the best evidence we have right now is showing that, correct? Mm-hmm.
Right. It has important medical implications and implications for a species to adapt to certain environments, but it's kind of ripples on the surface of an ocean. It's not changing anything fundamental.
Right. So the idea here is this only further strengthens your original case for irreducible complexity as well, right? So it's only making the project more difficult for Darwinists. Yeah.
One objection actually to my stuff and ID stuff is that people say, hey, all you do is criticize Darwin, you don't make a positive case for intelligent design. Right. But I do it in every book. They just ignore it because it's not evidence that of the kind that they generally think about.
Right. You have a wonderful section in Darwin Devolves on design inferences and intelligence and minds and all this or that. So again, if they just say that you don't do it, that's not true. They either haven't read it or they're lying. Now, again, principled charity wants to say ignorance before malice, but either isn't good, right? We don't want either of those things.
Yeah, that's right. Either way, it's wrong.
Now, another criticism that often comes up, and I think this is sort of an underhanded compliment because they're not attacking your case, but it is a very common one, is, well, we shouldn't count this as science because you guys don't make any predictions. Now, what would you say in response to that ID doesn't make any predictions, or at least any useful predictions?
Well, I think that's wrong. First of all, ID predicts you can't build complex biochemical machinery by a Darwinian process. And so for example, in Richard Lenski's decades-long 50,000 generation E. coli bacterium experiment, evolution experiment, if something had appeared, some new complex system had evolved in those circumstances, my case would be blown out of the water. Yet at the end of the experiment, we have these E. coli that are really sick puppies. They grow faster than they used to, but they got real problems. They have nothing new that they didn't have before. It could predict, it could have practical consequences if, for example, in developing antiviral medicines or antibiotics. Because if you believe, as Darwinists say they do, that evolution produced all these marvels, then if you make an antibiotic, it's inevitable that a bacterium will find its way around it. But if you think there might be limits because the basic machinery was designed and random mutation and selection can't get far around that, then you are more likely to try to find a medicine, a drug that will, defy these abilities, and so you're just more likely to keep plugging away at problems like that.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good response, is that, especially with these recent experiments, this is what we would expect given your hypothesis. It's not what we would expect given a neo-Darwinian hypothesis, right?
Yeah, it's really fascinating with Richard Lenski in particular. When I point out that his experiments are great, but they show genes being broken for their selective effect, for the ability of the bacteria to grow faster in his lab. He's written, oh, those really have nothing to do with how evolution occurs in nature. And well, why do you do them? Essentially, he and other folks disown their life's work when somebody like myself makes an unwelcome observation about it. So
here's a yeah, you can respond to this however you want, but how do you think your work would be received if you didn't advocate for intelligent design? Say you just did technical papers and you made critiques and you put it in very neutral language. Do you think people would have an issue with a lot of your critiques, or do you think it would just you wouldn't get as much attention? But
no, I don't think they would, because actually other scientists have done such things. In particular cases, they say that if you need a couple of mutations at once, well, it's going to slow things down a whole lot. Well, I said the same thing in The Edge of Evolution, and I got jumped on with both feet. There's a whole movement of scientists who don't think Darwin's mechanism is sufficient to explain life. These folks go by the name of the extended evolutionary synthesis. They think there must be something else, is what they think, but they have as much disdain for intelligent design as Darwinists do. And they're okay, they're tolerated, their work is published and so on. I can't say that they are the leaders of the evolutionary discipline, but they don't get disrespected. And I would guess that one third or so of working biologists don't think Darwin's mechanism is sufficient to explain all of life. Where you cross the line is if you say, you're right, I agree with everything you say, and I also think that we can see that this required purposeful design for these reasons. Then when you say anything that implicates something beyond nature or threatens to implicate that, then you have gone beyond the pale.
Right. Yeah, I think this is, I know it's somewhat aside of the technical arguments. I think it's important for people to recognize, because it's certainly true in philosophy, right? Where we have these sort of no-fly zones in terms of criticism, right? There's just a Castro consensus around any number of issues. And they tend to be issues that are of significant social and political import today, ironically, interestingly enough. And I'm sure people could guess what those issues might be. But the impression a lot of people have, and I think it's more with science than philosophy, is that it's always so pure, right? It's just when people put on their lab coats, they're completely disinterested, they're 100% objective, they're just after the truth. Maybe you could and I know this is BS in the philosophical circles, right? Or people are as biased and suffer from motivated reasoning as anybody else. And I'm not saying that I'm immune from it either. I try to do my best to look past it, but you have these sort of bully pressures pushing in, and you have case after case of people who will question a certain position very, very, very charitably. And then next thing you know is people are coming for their resignation, public humiliation. Their life is just made an absolute hell, to speak frankly, right? So I don't know, maybe as just on a personal note, you could speak to just what it's like being a practicing scientist, and what people's, you know, realistic expectations should be of what science involves, right?
Yeah, well, like many disciplines, I guess, including philosophy, there are problems that you can work on. You know, you can work on finding cures for cancer. You can work on, you know, what components are involved in this particular biochemical pathway and so on. But there are shared premises. And one big one is that, you know, life arose by natural processes, unguided and unfolded, developed, evolved by unguided processes. It doesn't need any help. And if you go across the line, again, you can suffer consequences. And the people who are putting you through the ringer will feel good about themselves because they think they're keeping science pure. They think they're keeping charlatans out of it. So they will not feel bad about themselves. They'll feel good about themselves. And in my own case, I was very lucky. I had tenure before I wrote my first book, and tenure is a wonderful institution, I think. And more than that, though, the folks at Lehigh, they didn't like this. They didn't agree with it, but they didn't care. And it was only when outside pressure came that they essentially publicly dissociated themselves from me. But hey, that's okay with me. I still had a job, so I didn't really mind. Other folks I know lost their jobs. Grad students were kicked out of laboratories. Other folks were forced to resign, had their health broken, all sorts of bad stuff. So social pressure has teeth, and it can be brought to bear on folks who deviate from the path. So if you are an up and coming science student, a graduate student or undergraduate studying, hoping for a career in science, and you have sympathies with ID or other things, then keep your mouth closed. Be very wary, and don't just, you know, throw yourself under the bus for no particular reason.
Right. Well, I'm happy to throw myself under the bus because I am a professor, right? Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, for me, at the end of the day, it's just what's true. I just want to know what's true, right? And I've spent a lot of time on this. And another kind of telling thing to me is I would talk to other scientists, again, religious scientists, even Catholic scientists who were, you know, publicly critical, but I've become friendly with them. And then, you know, over like a cup of coffee, I'll be like, tell me what you really think, right? And then the concessions start coming out, right? It's like, oh yeah, I actually think he has, you know, good points here or there. I'm like, hold on. Why say one thing in the public sphere, and then the attitude is very different? And it was just things like that it really started to convince me of like, okay, come on, are we gonna man up here and just do what needs to be done and challenge something? If the emperor really has no clothes, right? I want to know it, and I want other people to. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some new experiment will come out. When I say that I'm willing to be convinced, I mean that I'm willing to be convinced when I say it. I'll also admit that there's some things I'm not willing to be convinced on. 100%. There's a few issues that I think that I've worked through and are so important to me that I probably would, if something came out, I probably just would say, or it would take a very long time to change me on. I'm willing to admit that. This is not one of those issues. This is one of those issues where, like I said, if it turned out that all of this was wrong, it really wouldn't change much for me. It honestly wouldn't. I still have everything I originally had that brought me to my positions. So I guess I'm annoyed, as if it hasn't been the theme of this conversation, when it seems like there's a really good case that at the least deserves to be heard, and it's constantly ridiculed. People are threatened in various ways, directly or indirectly. And there's people who I think implicitly know that this deserves attention, but for whatever reason, don't want to champion it. You know what I'm saying? I'm sorry, I just threw a bunch out there, but
no, I certainly agree with you. And a swell example, I think, for the listeners, is a guy named Thomas Nagel, the philosopher from New York University. He's a very prominent philosopher, and he has been skeptical of Darwinism for a long time. And in 2012, he wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos: How the Neo-Darwinian Interpretation of Life is Almost Certainly False. I thought that was a great subtitle.
Indeed.
And the interesting thing is that he recognizes the existence of mind, and he recognizes the absurdity of many Darwinian claims, and he's an atheist. He himself, he said he doesn't want there to be a God. He admits that many smart people and his colleagues believe in God, but he doesn't want to. Nonetheless, he's written this and wrote about how Darwinism just doesn't cut it. And he was essentially berated by his colleagues. They called him essentially an old man over the hill, and worse. So there, it's very strong social pressure. But if you, and the problem is that a lot of folks are essentially isolated. That is, they stick their head out of the foxhole and they're vulnerable. But if everybody or a lot of people got up at once and proclaimed that, we don't think this is true, or we demand answers or some such thing, it'd be safer for people's careers. But it's hard to coordinate all of that stuff.
Right. Nobody wants to be the pioneer and the chance that you'll come back full of arrows.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
But at the same time, I mean, come on, let's move with this thing, right? I think we've got more than enough that we need. One more case on that point, and then I want to talk about some of the stuff that's in your new book and discuss where people can get it. Anthony Flew is a good example, right? So he was very well-known philosophical atheist. In fact, I think one of his books has a subtitle of How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And he's kind of interesting because some of the things that caused him to change his mind were both the philosophical arguments, but a lot of what has come out of the ID movement as well. Now, the other point is not just that here's a man who changed his mind when he really just tried to better understand the case, but he too was berated. They said, oh, he's just slipped into senility. He's lost his right. And he said, no, I haven't. No, what are you guys talking about? Right. It's just like, it's amazing. It's just absolutely. And I just want people to understand that science is amazing. I love science. I love philosophy. It's why I do it. But it's not this pure thing that is completely free of social or political pride. That's the real point I'm trying to get across, I think.
And there are people who actively patrol the borders of what they think science should be, and I guess philosophy too. And if you move over, they are quick to jump. And in this age of the internet and so on, it's easy to bring a lot of pressure to bear.
Right. Okay. So for the last couple of minutes here, let's talk about your new book. It is called A Mousetrap for Darwin. Excellent title. It's just couldn't think of a better one there. So tell us what is this book all about? What caused you to put this one together, and what can the readers expect from it?
It's a collection of my responses to critics over the past 25 years or so. And I was moved to put it together. First of all, Discovery Institute asked me to, but I was pushing it off. But then a year and a half ago, when my latest book, Darwin Devolves, was reviewed, and the reviewers ignored all of my responses and brought up old objections, then I saw that there was a need, because a lot of my comments over the years to specific experiments, to specific arguments, were published here and there and in various venues. And there was no good place where somebody who wanted to see what the responses were to find them. So I brought them. There were op-eds from the New York Times, and there's responses in Philosophy of Science, and a lot of blog posts and so on. Some very new material just written this year, some stuff written just for the book itself. So this contains all of the responses to the most common criticisms, so that the hope is that then when in the next book, when the reviewers come, they can just ignore one source instead of many other sources.
Yeah, fantastic. So what I'm going to do is we'll do a little giveaway. So I'm going to buy an extra copy or two of this book. And gentle listeners, if you want to win, just do me a favor, leave a comment wherever you're listening or watching, whether that's on YouTube or iTunes. And it'll stay a week from when this airs. I'll just pick a few people at random. Don't wait to win. Go get this book now. Go get it on Amazon or wherever else. And if you win a copy, well, there's a Christmas gift. I can't think of a better Christmas gift than this. Maybe. All right. But you're right. It's and just to emphasize again, these podcast conversations are not sufficient. We're just scratching the surface here. Yeah. And Dr. Behe, one thing I really appreciate about you is not just your intellectual precision, but you're also a really engaging writer. It's genuinely enjoyable to read your books and your essays. You got a very good, sharp wit. You're great with analogies too. So for people who might not, who might feel, is it going to be too technical or sciencey? Don't worry about that. I think you've got a great way of balancing the technical argumentation while also making it accessible as well.
Yeah, I always try to write for the general public, and I always try to have a good time while I'm writing, because I know that I'm not going to convince or be able to convince or succeed with just the scientific community. It's only if we go outside, people who haven't bought into the Darwinian paradigm and who have open minds, and if it becomes more widely known that there's a problem, then there's a chance that will penetrate back into the scientific community or by young people who will be future scientists.
Yeah, and hopefully we can help with that. So Dr. Behe, just to finish up then, where is the best place to grab a copy of the book? And then do you have any other new projects or anything else coming up that people should keep an eye out for?
Well, of course, it's available on Amazon in any format, pretty much Kindle, paperback, or hardcover. And I urge you to get the hardcover because I get a better cut of that. Yeah.
No. And it's not. I don't like reading on digital either. So get the paper.
Yeah, exactly. And right now I'm working on promoting this book and answering any criticisms but I do have a project, but it's for a few years down the road. So I'll keep it to myself for now.
Great. Well, that will at least eventually give us another excuse to invite you back on. Dr. Behe, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay. Thanks for having me, Pat.